Hello everybody. Gratitude to everybody for listening, and additional heaps of gratitude to everybody who donates to the Patreon account. You keep the show going with your donations. As I keep the expenses paid, the more content I can create. You can donate at www.patreon.com/leader1. Or, if you'd like to make a one-time donation, you can send one through PayPal at morganrector331@hotmail.com. Remember, there is no minimum donation, no maximum donation. If $1 a month is all you feel like you can manage, especially in these difficult times, it's still appreciated. Thank you for everything, and enjoy the show. Welcome to Human Monsters. Red Bluff, California. The Lettys, an elderly couple, recalled a married couple who once lived next door by the name of Cameron and Janice Hooker. Mrs. Letty described them as a nice couple. They were hard-working, responsible, and quiet. Cameron came across as very serious. He cut trees and fashioned them into fence posts, which were put up for sale. Mr. Letty said he was all business, you might say. May 19th, 1977. Colleen Stan was hitchhiking. She lived in Eugene, Oregon at the time, but she was heading to the town of Westwood, California, to join her friend Linda in celebration of her birthday. She waited for a friendly face to pick her up as she stood on the side of Interstate 5 with her thumb out. Her parents were Jack and Evelyn Martin. They divorced when Colleen was 3. She was primarily raised by her mother in Riverside, California. She had a happy childhood, with her spare time spent playing with her sisters. She was artistic with a flair for poetry and handmade crafts. She was not academically inclined and dropped out of high school at age 16. She married 22-year-old Tom Stan. Her father gave his approval for them to marry, which occurred when she was close to 17. Their marriage fell apart soon after relocating to his native Ohio. Back in California, Colleen made strides toward getting her life together. She wrote a high school equivalency exam, held down several jobs, and drifted in and out of relationships. She had to reject a couple of rides. The first offer came from a car filled with young men. She wasn't interested in becoming a party favor for a bunch of frat boys. Another car offered her a ride, but they weren't going far enough. Finally, a couple pulled up in a Dodge Colt. The wife was holding a baby in her arms. They weren't far off from Colleen's age. There is something about the presence of a baby that suggests a threat level of 0. So she got in the car. They told her they were headed toward a township called Mineral. Mineral was on the way to Westwood, so Colleen was happy to jump aboard. She got in the back seat. The drive was underway, and there were a couple of curious incidents. Colleen noticed a strange wooden box next to her. She didn't say anything about it, and she wasn't about to root through anybody else's belongings, especially when she was within 4 feet of them. It was about this time that she spilled some grape juice on herself after the car accelerated. She also noticed an exchange between the driver and his wife. Without saying a word, he gave his wife a look, at which she frowned and shook her head. Whatever the subtext, their message was imbued with meaning. The driver kept looking back at Colleen in the rearview mirror. After a while, it began to make Colleen nervous. A few miles later, the couple stopped at a gas station. Colleen went to the restroom to change her blouse, since there was a large spot of grape juice on it. While she was in the washroom changing, she was struck by a premonition. She felt like she should ditch the couple. She didn't expect this feeling, and she didn't understand it. She ignored it and returned to the car. As they resumed their journey, all three adults engaged in conversation. At one point, the driver introduced the subject of ice caves. At one point he said, "My brother said there were some ice caves up around here. Wouldn't that be something to see?" He took another look at Colleen in the rearview mirror and said, "You wouldn't care if we turned off for a quick look, would you?" Colleen only wanted to go to Westwood, but she told them she wouldn't mind a quick detour. The couple discussed where the turnoff was. Before long, they were driving down a dirt road. After driving about a mile down the dirt road, they stopped the car. The wife got out of the car with the baby and walked over to a stream. The driver got out of the car. He went around to the passenger side door and pulled the seat forward. He got in and put a knife to Colleen's throat. He said, "Put your hands above your head." Colleen was frozen from fear. She couldn't bring herself to do anything. He issued his directive again. She felt the cold, incisive blade against her throat. His hand was shaking. She lifted her arms above her head. Now she was shaking. He grabbed her hands and locked them with handcuffs. He pulled out a section of cloth and wrapped it around her head to conceal her eyes. He said, "Are you going to do what I tell you to do?" There was a menacing look about him now. Colleen said, "Yes." Next thing she knew, a leather strap was encircling her head. It was straightened and tightened on her cheek and under her chin. She was gagged. She was now unable to speak or open her mouth at all. He grabbed her ankles and wrapped rope around them. He tied an expert-level knot. He had carried the operation out with so much precision, it seemed that it might have been rehearsed or indicative of experience. Next stop, the box. The man opened the box. It didn't look like much, constructed as it was, with plywood. The interior was carpeted. There was a circular hole at the bottom that split into semicircles at both sides. He forced Colleen to lie down on the seat. He pushed her head into the box. Once her neck was firmly into place, he closed the box around her head. It was punctuated with a snap-like sound. The world within the box was entirely devoid of light and sound. It was airtight, making it difficult for her to breathe. It was intensely hot. He covered her with the sleeping bag she had with her. The family and their captive headed home. After killing time driving to this location and that, the couple finally pulled into the alley behind their house at night. The man untied Colleen's ankles and removed the head box. The blindfold, gag, and handcuffs remained in place. She was unable to escape. She was led up a set of stairs and through a kitchen. From there she was oriented through a narrow door and down a steep flight of stairs. He brought her down to the basement. His wife did not accompany them. Once they were in the basement, the man said, "Stand up here." He brought her up on top of something. a Coleman ice chest. He unlocked one of the cuffs and wrapped both of them around a pipe that ran along the ceiling. He locked the cuff back into place. She was now trapped with her arms above her head. Having put her where he wanted her, he removed her jeans. He threw them to the floor. Anticipating rape, Colleen was sick with fear. He removed one of the handcuffs so he could remove her shirt, one sleeve at a time. Following this, he replaced the cuffs with wide and taut leather bands. They were hooked to the ceiling. Her arms were stretched as far apart as he could stretch them without pulling them out of their sockets. As Colleen was struggling to make sense of what was happening to her, the Coleman was kicked out from underneath her, and before she knew it, her shoulders and wrists were burning with pain. The pain was excruciating, but she couldn't cry out because of the leather strap that held her jaw in place. Tears fell from her eyes. She flailed her limbs about, but it was all for naught. She couldn't reach a surface. The linings of the cuffs were very sharp, and now that she was suspended as she was, they were cutting into her skin. She kicked her legs outward. This was just an introduction to the pain that would be visited upon her. The man whipped her back. He whipped her stomach. He whipped her torso. He continued to strike as he screamed at her to stop kicking already and relax. She went limp. She cried, audible only to her. He ceased the whipping. Welts were forming on her body. He went walking around the basement. She didn't know what he was up to. Through a slit at the bottom of the blindfold, she spotted a magazine. He was showing her a picture of a naked woman who was suspended in a similar way. She thought to herself, "Why me? Oh God, why me?" She heard his footsteps heading toward her. She heard a dull scraping sound. He grabbed her ankles. She felt something brush against her toes. She was able to stand on her tiptoes to relieve the strain that was put on her wrists and shoulders. Whatever he had been doing, the man was done, and now he walked up the stairs, leaving her alone in the basement. He wasn't finished. He brought his wife down to the basement. Through the slit at the bottom of the blindfold, she saw a dimly lit room, which was illuminated only with a single light bulb. It had a concrete floor. She saw a wooden structure, like a table. The next thing she saw was movement. Her captors removed their clothes and lay down before her, where they proceeded to have sex. They were using the image of her indentured slavery as stimulation. This made Colleen ill. It was too strange for her, too tawdry and perverse. Not her scene at all. Once the couple finished having sex, the woman ran upstairs. The husband stayed downstairs with Colleen. He removed the support beneath her feet. Pain shot up and down her body as her weight pulled at her joints. She was naked except for her socks. Not wanting to incur his wrath, she didn't kick her legs. He rewarded her by putting the ice chest back beneath her feet. She was relieved to be able to stand, though her body was now devoid of tension and strength. He removed her wrists from the hook on the beam and brought her down. He led her across the floor to another part of the basement. He forced her into another of his constructions, a square box. It was 3 feet high. One end was open, and he pushed her into it face first. He grabbed her wrists and replaced the leather cuffs with chains. They were locked to the roof of the box. The dimensions of the interior of the box left her in a cramped position. Her arms were suspended above her, and there was hardly any room to sit up. The pressure on her jaw was loosened, and the leather gag was removed. Now that she could speak, she begged him to let her go. She was interrupted when he placed the head box from the car to the roof of this larger box. She was trapped in darkness once again, though this time it was her entire body. Pitch black darkness. Limited oxygen. Her movements restricted to fidgeting. She began to suffocate. She kicked and flailed against the walls, but nothing worked. The man returned. He grabbed her ankles and wrapped them with a cord. He tied them to the side of the box to prevent her from kicking. With that, he left. She cried, screamed, struggled to breathe, and perspired. Uncertain of whether this would lead to an instant death or long-term incarceration, she panicked. He returned. After fussing with the clasps on the head box, it was opened. Colleen sucked in all the oxygen she could. Before she could bring herself to speak, he said, "Why the hell are you making so much noise?" A classic example of an offender's solipsistic feeling of entitlement. She said, "I can't breathe. Please, please let me out. Let my arms down. It hurts so much. I can't breathe." He replied by shutting the head box back up, depriving her of air once again. After stepping away for a minute, he returned with some object with which she had no experience, visually or otherwise. He wrapped it around her chest and tightened it so hard the pressure ground against her ribs. It was even harder to breathe now that it hurt just to expand her chest. This guy was a connoisseur of torture and pain products. Case in point, he placed some kind of prickly object between her legs. The shape was reminiscent of that of a hair curler. It was outfitted with metallic bristles on all sides. He was dissatisfied with the device, but he left it there and secured the box shut. Colleen would learn later that the device was to be used to administer electric shocks. Throughout the night, Colleen was left alone in the dark. The sound of her own breathing and heartbeat was nearly deafening after a while. She anticipated that she would suffocate. She expected that death was imminent. Occasionally her captor would return, and she would feel his hands on her back. It didn't lead to relief or a consolidation of her current tortures. It was the BDSM Dom equivalent of, "Pinch me, I must be dreaming." Cameron Hooker sure knew what he was doing. It was the result of 2 years of planning and construction. The desire to bring his fantasy to fruition was even more deeply rooted, with a seedling residing deeply within him for many years. It would have been totally unexpected to anyone who grew up with him. He was born in Alturas, California, on November 5, 1953. He was not abused, and he was part of a typical American nuclear family. He was remembered as a happy child. The evil wasn't beaten or raped into him. He was just a demon seed. As an adolescent, he had no close friends and spent a lot of time alone. He was not considered by girls to be attractive due to his skinny and awkward appearance. He liked to envision himself as virile and intimidating in his sexual fantasies, which were inhabited by women who were naked and bound, given over to him like lambs to the slaughter. His discovery of bondage pornography further fueled these fantasies. His life continued along this trajectory into adulthood. He always hoped he would find a woman who would submit to him and accept him as her master. (1973) A mutual friend introduced Cameron to a 15-year-old girl named Janice. She was shy, green, and insecure. She was unassertive and submissive. Pliable. She could be prevailed upon by aggressive and dominant personalities. Bingo. Cameron went to work on Janice, pulling out all the stops to impress and endear himself to her. She found him attractive and was pleased to discover he had a car. He was 19 years old, but she didn't find the prospect of statutory rape off-putting in his case, so they began to go on dates. Janice didn't get much attention at home, so Cameron's flattery and affections were a welcome reprieve from the emotional wasteland of her home life. She feared rejection, having been ignored so much at home. As she put it, "No matter how good or rotten a guy was to me, I just kind of latched on to him." She desperately wanted to be loved, and in exchange, she would give Cameron nearly anything he asked for in return. Cameron knew this, and he was quick to capitalize on it. He told her he wanted to hang her naked body from a tree. He dispelled her reservations by telling her that all his ex-girlfriends let him do it, and that it was normal and popular with other people. She didn't want to lose him, so she agreed to do it. He took her to some mountains nearby, where he strapped her into his handmade leather cuffs and hung her. She did not enjoy the experience. She was frightened. Pain screamed throughout her arms and back. When he finally took her down, Cameron was very tender with her, holding her, hugging her, kissing her. He was happy with her. He rewarded her with the thing she wanted most: love. These occurrences became routine, with Cameron taking her to the woods 2 or 3 times a month. She didn't enjoy bondage, and it was even less appealing when he whipped or beat her. He didn't strike her hard enough to leave scars, but it was still exceedingly painful. When she begged to be released, he would release her. She didn't think he would ever take it so far that he would kill her. That's why she let him tie her wrists and dunk her head in a stream. He would hold her head under long enough to risk drowning, and then pull it out. As always, he rewarded her with love. It was transactional. He got what he wanted. She got what she wanted. Outside of the rubric of BDSM, he was polite, charming, funny, and a lot of fun. She could excuse the bondage, whippings, and boudoir photography as the dues she had to pay for his attention. After about 1.5 years, she knew she was in love with him. She wasn't entirely sure of his feelings. She decided to force his hand. She lied to him about being pregnant. She expected that he would propose marriage. Though her parents had reservations about her marrying at 16, they liked Cameron and gave their approval. They gave her $500 as a wedding present, which is about $2,922. They married in Reno, Nevada, on January 18, 1975. Throughout their marriage, Cameron's experimentation with BDSM became more progressively dark and dangerous. He would choke her until she passed out. Once when they had a fight, He put a knife to her throat and asked her if she wanted to die. He once showed her a scene that was depicted in an underground adult newspaper of a woman who was literally crucified. He told Janice he decided that if he were to kill her, the crucifixion was the route he would take. Gradually, Janice began to feel unsafe in his presence. Still, she indulged his penchant for torture and captivity. The one time she refused was when he placed an army surplus gas mask over her head, in which she could not breathe. The experiments were getting stranger and more aggressive. It became so painful she was no longer willing to participate. Eventually, Cameron proposed freshening things up with a threesome. He told her the third participant would indulge him in his more torturous experimentation, thereby taking the heat off her. This was much more appealing to Janice. There are women out there who enjoy getting hurt on purpose, and he was sure to find them. Janice still loved Cameron, and she was relieved that he would express his dominant and sadistic side with another woman. Despite this, she was concerned the third party would pose a threat to their marriage. She insisted that he never have actual intercourse with the other woman. After negotiating their terms, they decided that each of them would bring a person into their lives. He would have a sex slave, and Janice would have a baby. Their daughter was born in fall of 1976. In the meantime, Cameron was hard at work on building his sex and torture dungeon in the basement. The day after she was abducted, Cameron Hooker went downstairs and released Colleen from the box. He walked her across the basement and laid her down on a rack. He locked the chains on her wrists to the hooks on the top corners of the rack. He left her there with the headbox on all day long. That evening, Cameron brought down some food for Colleen, a bowl of potatoes au gratin and a glass of water. He removed the headbox so she could eat. He left the blindfold on. She sat on the edge of the rack as she ate. The chains jangled as she masticated. When she finished eating, she was allowed to use a bedpan, which was emptied by Cameron upstairs. When he came back down, he replaced the chains with the leather cuffs. He left her hanging for a while. Eventually he came back and put the headbox back on her, chained her back to the rack, and left her suspended in darkness. For the second meal, he brought her 2 egg salad sandwiches and a glass of water. She hadn't eaten for 24 hours. He let her up from the box so she could eat. The heat of the space and the anxiety that tormented her had alleviated her appetite. All she could eat was half a sandwich. She drank all the water. After this, she told him she was full. He was infuriated. He said, "You should be grateful I brought this to you." He told her she was wasting good food. He ordered her to finish it. She told him she was grateful. She was just too full to eat another bite. He was enraged. He placed the leather cuffs on her wrists and hung her from the beam. He was hell-bent on teaching her a lesson. He whipped her until the pain became so overwhelming she passed out. When Colleen came to, she was still hanging from the ceiling. She was standing on the Coleman. She felt lightheaded. Her knees buckled, but instead of pulling her to the floor, Cameron pulled the Coleman out from under her feet and dealt out more lashings. Having whipped Colleen to his satisfaction, Cameron took her down. He put her back on the rack. He placed the remainder of her meal in front of her. He said, "Now do you want to finish this?" Colleen was in no mood to eat. She was experiencing intense back pain, and she was in a weakened state. Then again, she was also terrified of what Cameron would do if she didn't finish the sandwiches, so she force-fed herself what remained. Now that she was finished with the food, he placed the head box back on her, locked her onto the rack, and left. Such became the routine of her existence in the house of Cameron and Janice Hooker. Colleen's roommate in Oregon, Alice Walsh, became concerned when she didn't return to their apartment on Saturday, May 21st. It occurred to her that she may have visited her mother. She called Colleen's mother, but she said she hadn't seen or heard from her. Alice filed a missing persons report. A description of Colleen was included. Stan, Colleen Jean. Date of birth, December 31st, 1956. White female, 5'6", 135 pounds. Long, light brown hair. Blue eyes. Freckles. Last seen wearing gray t-shirt. Blue jeans, plaid jacket, brown shoes. Has sleeping bag, sweater, and purse. There were no responses to the bulletin. She simply disappeared. In the meantime, Colleen drew her strength from prayer. There was nothing else, besides that and her childhood memories. At that point, it felt like nobody in the world cared about her. As always, if Colleen ever disobeyed or disrespected Cameron, he would whip her until she fainted. Sometimes during meals, she would attempt to have a conversation with Cameron, but he usually reacted with rage. Mercy was not forthcoming. The food had nothing to do with relief. He fed her so he wouldn't lose his slave. Every time she asked him when he would let her go, he would say, "Pretty soon." Over a span of 10 days, Cameron constructed a new implement to torture Colleen. It was 3 feet tall and 6.5 feet long. There was a lid on top. It was double-walled, creating a confining space similar to a coffin. Cameron put Colleen into the box without a word. He was generous enough to remove the head box and the gag. He left the blindfold intact, and she was still naked. He ordered her to step over the side and get in. From there, she was to lie down. He put her sleeping bag on the floor of the box so that she wouldn't have to suffer the discomfort of sleeping on solid wood. He approached her with a long chain. He put it around her neck and locked the wrist chains to it. He pulled it down to her ankles and secured them. Still keen on depriving her of her senses, he placed wax earplugs in her ears. He shut the box and secured it with a padlock. A few days after Father's Day, Colleen's parents went to her apartment to collect her belongings, which would be put in storage. As they drove back to her mother's town, they drove within a mile of Red Bluff. They had no idea that their daughter was confined in a sexual sadist's basement, imprisoned in his homemade sadomasochistic torture chamber. She hadn't bathed for 5 weeks. She hadn't brushed her teeth for as long. Her hair hadn't been washed. There was complete cessation of her menstrual cycle. She was so hot during the day that the sleeping bag was drenched in her sweat. Cameron installed 2 fans that kept the air in the box circulating, but they didn't cool her. He noticed that she was losing weight. He made her stand on a bathroom scale and wrote down how much she weighed on a given day. Janice generally stayed away from the basement. On occasion, she might do something like give Colleen a glass of lemonade, but this did not occur on a regular basis. Occasionally, Colleen would hear Cameron taking photos of her. The whippings were still a routine occurrence. They were never as painful as the suspension. Hanging for hours on end every day took its toll on her joints. Sometimes her only escape came from blacking out. The same pain would jolt her awake. Hanging someone in this fashion is dangerous. The cuffs cut off the circulation. If that continues longer than 20 minutes or a half hour, the tissue dies and gangrene will set in, necessitating amputation if necrosis hasn't already taken place. Cameron would switch up her torture to ensure this did not happen. After 3 months of hygienic neglect, Colleen smelled rank. Not only had she not bathed, but she was sweating for hours every day. She looked dirty. The lack of sun took its toll on her complexion. One evening he took her out of the box and brought her upstairs, where he ran her a bath. He tied her hands behind her back. He wrapped duct tape around her blindfold. He placed tape over her mouth. To ensure she wouldn't run, he tied her legs to a broomstick. She didn't get to cleanse herself in her customary way. He pushed her head under water until she nearly drowned. She was unable to pull her head out of the water because he lodged the broomstick across the rim of the tub, which prevented her from pulling her knees up. He would wait until he saw the last of the bubbles and she began to swallow water. He would then pull her head out by her hair. He would dunk her again and go through the entire process a few more times. He documented it with photographs. He did it so many times her lungs began to burn. Janice dealt with Colleen's hair. It was a tangled, matted, and filthy rat's nest. Janice put vegetable oil on Colleen's head, but she still couldn't comb the knots out. All she could do at that point was cut it, which she did. She cut 5 inches of Colleen's hair. Naturally, Colleen was taken back downstairs to the basement and the box afterwards. Janice felt sorry for Colleen, though not sorry enough to call the police. She felt she could not leave Cameron because she had never lived independently and felt she had to rely on him. One thing that changed the situation somewhat was when she got a job in Silicon Valley. She stayed with her sister during the week. She was almost as eager to escape their house as Colleen. The tortures became more painful and sadistic. One day Cameron held a heat lamp next to her skin. He delighted in watching her writhe in pain as it burned her. On another occasion, he jabbed her with live electric wires. He would hang her upside down and in other ways to mix it up. He forced her to perform oral sex on him. He would strangle her. He would do anything painful short of actually killing her. Colleen could not always correlate the frequency and intensity of the tortures with Cameron's moods. Sometimes he tortured her out of anger, but other times he was purely to gratify himself. Occasionally he would bring her 2 meals in one day. No explanation was given for this gesture of unfathomable generosity. She stopped asking when he would release her. Cameron rigged the box in such a way that though she could not escape, she was free enough to use her hands for working. He would force her to do piecework for some of his construction projects. 6 months after she was abducted, Cameron allowed her to remove her blindfold. She was still not allowed to look at him, but she could at least take in her environment. From the abyss into hell. Colleen spent her 21st birthday in the box. To her surprise, Cameron gave her a gift, a blue terry cloth nightgown. She had been complaining about how cold it was in the workshop at night. The nightgown was indeed warm. January 1st, 1978. Cameron read the latest edition of an underground newspaper called Inside News. An article on page 6 inspired him like no other. He was compelled by the ideas that were laid out. He was riveted by the title alone. They sell themselves body and soul when they sign the slavery contract. Wanting to create a pristine copy of the contract, he rented a typewriter to create his own. He got Janice to type the fields. Next to the field that read Master, he told her to write Michael Powers instead of his real name. Next to the field marked Witness, he got her to type Janet Powers as her own alias. The contract reproduced the original calligraphy and added a seal at the bottom. January 25th, 1978. Cameron went down to the basement, clipboard in hand, and ordered Colleen to practice writing her name. She was baffled, but did as she was told. Having done this, he gave her the newspaper article that had affected him so much, and told her to read it in its entirety. Colleen hadn't read anything in 251 days. Now she was reading an article about the trafficking of women. The gist was that the so-called S&M rage created such a high demand for participants that standard practices of the prostitution trade could not satisfy its customers. It claimed that even in the United States, women were being forced to sign contracts that effectively relinquished control over their bodies and lives. They were to be sold into slavery, and as a result, they had no human rights. They were at the mercy of their owners, who could do whatever they wanted with them and to them. It was coordinated and controlled by a network of traffickers, essentially an organized crime syndicate. Colleen was horrified. Cameron said, "They know you're here." By they, he meant the company, which was the organization that facilitated the human trafficking operation as described in the article. He said he would have to register her. He handed her the slavery contract. He said that if she didn't sign it, the company would take her away. She read the details of the proposed contractual arrangement, which went as follows. This indenture, made the 25th day of January, in the year of our Lord, 1978, between Colleen Stan, hereafter known as Slave, and Michael Powers, hereafter known as Master, witnesseth that slave for and in consideration and in humble appreciation of such care and attention as Master may choose to afford her, has given, granted, aliened, and fiefed, and conveyed, and by these presents does give, grant, and fief, and convey unto Master all of slave's body, and each and every part thereof, without reservation, every bit of her will as to all matters and things, and the entirety of her soul, together with all and singular, every privilege, advantage, and appurtenance to the same belonging or in any wise appertaining. Also all the estate, right, title, interest, property, claims, ego, and id of slave in of and to the same and in of and to every part and parcel thereof, to have and to hold, all in singular, the above described body, will, soul, and premises, with all pertinences thereof, unto Master, and any of his assigns forever. And the said slave does covenant, promise, and agree. 1. She shall immediately, diligently, and enthusiastically comply with and submit her full being to any and all directions or desires of master or his assigns which he or they may express by word, signal, action, or any other means. 2. She shall at all times afford master absolute respect, shall address him only as sir or master, shall station herself in a physical position subordinate to his whenever possible, and shall speak to or otherwise distract him only when granted his permission. 3. She shall constantly maintain her female body parts in such circumstances as will demonstrate and ensure that they are fully open to him. In particular, she shall never cross her legs in his presence, shall wear no undergarments at any time, and shall cover no part of her body with apparel or material of any description, except when the act of doing so and design of the item are expressly approved by him. 4. She shall preserve her female body parts for the exclusive use of him and his assigns, which use shall be the sole source of her pleasures, and she shall engage in no self-gratification nor any physical contact with any others. And slave does hereby irrevocably declare and acknowledge her everlasting unconditional dedication to serving master to his full satisfaction, and she ashamedly confesses that prior indulgence of her untempered conduct by others may have permitted her to become afflicted with inferior habits that may prove unsatisfactory to master, from which imperfections she implores master to free her by retraining with corporal punishment or any other means which he, in his unquestionable wisdom, deems effective toward directing her to her sole ambition and life destiny of perfectly fulfilling his every desire of her. In witness whereof, slave has hereunto set her hand, and master has designed to seal these presents by permanently affixing his collar about her neck on the date first above written. Colleen thought, this is the work of the devil. She was horrified and overwhelmed by what she had just read. Stunned, she was unable to say a word or make a move. She began to cry and shake uncontrollably. Cameron was tremendously gratified by her distress. Getting herself together for a moment, she said, "What if I don't sign it?" "If you don't, I'll sign it for you and make you wish you had." "Well, who is Michael Powers?" "I'm known by 2 names. That's my company name." There was one word she was perplexed by. It was spelled Enfeofded. Enfeefed? She asked what that word meant. He was unable or unwilling to tell her. He barked at her to sign the contract. He told her a company messenger was waiting for it upstairs. Colleen wanted him to know she wasn't going to relinquish everything. He could keep her confined in the basement. He could coerce her into signing the contract, and he could have his way with her body. But, she told him, you can never have my soul. He allowed that point, saying, I know, that's God's. He still pressed her to sign the contract. Colleen wrote her name next to a field that read, Forever Slave. Janice signed as a witness. Cameron told Colleen that the company, which wasn't actually real, required that she wear a slave collar as identification. Naturally, the collar was tight. It was not only uncomfortable, but it itched. He told her it would cost him $1,500 to register her with the company. He said that he would be able to let her out of the house to do things for him because the company were providing support in terms of security. They would watch the house. They would listen in on phone conversations. If she were to run away, they would catch her and torture her so severely it would be a miracle if she survived the ordeal. He said one tactic involved nailing the victim's hands to a beam and leaving them hanging there for days. He told her a made-up story about Janice, claiming she was a slave and that she had tried to escape. A policeman picked her up while she was hitchhiking. She thought she was safe with him, but it turned out he was a member of the company. He took her back to her owners, where she was nailed to a beam. She hung for 3 days until she went into convulsions and was taken down. She was then placed on a rack, where her legs were twisted until her knees and hips were permanently damaged. This last detail terrified Colleen because Janice wore a brace on her knee. The problem with her knee turned out to be unrelated. He gave Colleen a BDSM revisionist version of the story of how he and Janice met, claiming he met her in another company member's dungeon. He told her other horrific stories about the company's practices, and she had no reason to disbelieve him. He gave her a slave name. He chose the letter K. Those unfamiliar with the situation would spell it K-A-Y. There were many conditions for living as Cameron Hooker's slave. If she wanted to ask him a question, she was required to kneel before him prior to doing so. Anything she wanted to do could only be done with his permission. She was notified that if she contacted any member of her family, the company would punish her by crucifying her for 5 days. They would follow up by murdering the relatives she contacted. Having understood and accepted these rules, she was allowed to leave the basement. This didn't mean she was free. She was mainly brought upstairs to work. She was only allowed to speak when she needed to ask for instructions. He didn't want her to have much contact with Janice. He told her that if she ever displeased Janice in any way, he would kill her. She mostly did housework. She was permitted to use the bathroom, but only after kneeling and asking permission first, of course. When he felt like disciplining Colleen, he would shout, "Attention drill." Colleen was to strip off her clothes, stand on her tiptoes to reach to the top of the doorway's arch between the living room and dining room. She was to stand in that position until he told her she could do otherwise. Cameron had more slave stories for her. He claimed that it was a family business, with him and his father and brother being involved with the company. He said his father and brother no longer aligned themselves with the organization, but might want to, quote-unquote, borrow her for, quote, parties. To frighten her further, he told her a story about a runaway who had been indentured into slavery by the company. She wrote a news article about her experience. 3 months later, the company tracked her down. They devised an especially brutal punishment for her. Without anesthesia, they pulled off her fingers one at a time, pulled off her toes one at a time. A member who was a surgeon removed her arms and legs. Her tongue was cut out. Her hearing was disabled. They blinded her with a soldering gun. Having finished with all that, she was hung on a hook next to her master's bed. By terrorizing Colleen with this story, he wanted to establish the idea that there was a worse fate than being his slave. Janice believed that Cameron still honored their agreement that he would not have sex with Colleen. Wanting to be reassured, she decided to ask him, though she prevaricated a little. One morning she asked him if he wanted to bring Colleen upstairs to have sex with her. She should have worded the question with more clarity. Cameron jumped right out of bed and went down to the basement. He put the leather cuffs on Colleen's wrists, placed the blindfold around her head, which was secured with tape, and gagged her. He placed Colleen on the bed, where he proceeded to tie her wrists to eye hooks in the headboard. He tied her feet to the bottom corners of the bed. Colleen didn't realize Janice was there until both she and Cameron got on the bed. Cameron got between the women. He kissed and touched both of them. This would never be enough for him. He mounted Colleen. Janice got up and ran to the bathroom, crying all the way. Colleen heard her retching. When Janice returned to the bedroom, she put on her clothes and began to leave. Cameron got up and stopped her. He calmed her, talked her into staying, and put Janice back in the basement. After Janice went back to work, Cameron started spending more time with Colleen, since his and Janice's work schedules were not congruent. At this point, part of the drills involved making Colleen jog. She didn't have much energy due to the restrictive food intake, so she would become winded easily. Cameron would lean out of his car and say something like, "You better not stop or I'll beat the hell out of you." When he felt she had run enough, he would make her disrobe and swim laps in a pond. Cameron built a new contraption for suspending Colleen. When she didn't follow directions on a macrame project, she was not only hung, but shocked with electrical wires. Her skin was severely burned. The scars on her thighs never completely faded. Cameron also made a device called the stretcher. It consisted of 2 heavy boards nailed into a T shape. There was a winch attached to the bottom. There were hooks at either end of the cross. He put Colleen on the device. He placed the leather cuffs on her wrists, and he attached them to the hooks at the top. He locked her ankles to the chain that wrapped around the winch. Before this torture session, he said to her, "I'm not doing this to punish you. I'm doing this because I enjoy it." Once she was securely attached to the contraption, he began to turn the winch, which led to a tightening of the chain. Colleen's body began to ache as the cuffs burrowed into her skin, cutting off the circulation. Due to the position she was contorted into, her diaphragm was pulled, which made it difficult for her to breathe. The pain was intense and keenly felt in her hands, wrists, ribs, legs, and ankles. This still didn't satisfy Cameron. He strangled her until she passed out. He released his grip after she went unconscious. When she came to, he choked her again. Colleen assumed she was finally going to die this time. She was petrified. Cameron demanded that she beg for mercy. She tried, but after being strangled so many times, she found it hard to speak. Cameron criticized her poor showing as a beggar. Feeling he should be compensated, Cameron removed his clothing and demanded oral sex. He would often rape and sodomize her while she endured the tortures of being bound by the stretcher. She was also whipped while tied to the contraption. These tortures became routine to the point where whenever Colleen was put in the stretcher, she would receive injuries that lasted for days, making it difficult for her to sleep in certain positions. He cut off the circulation in her arms one day and poured hot water on her arms until it returned. Eventually, Colleen was given more freedom. She would be permitted to spend longer periods outdoors. She came to enjoy tending to the Hookers' vegetable garden. She also became a nanny for the couple's children. It was around this time that Cameron told her further identification would be required of her by the company. After inserting a needle through her right labia, he inserted a gold earring. At some point, Janice quit her job, which left the family in dire financial straits. Cameron took Colleen to Reno, Nevada, and forced her to panhandle, which is considered to be a form of human trafficking. Colleen hated it, but she put an end to the complaining when she considered the consequences. She considered running away or telling one of the strangers about the trouble she was in. The reason she didn't was she believed Cameron's lies about the company and its commitment to surveillance. Colleen's jogging was curtailed after a neighbor buttonholed her into a conversation one day. Cameron allotted a specific amount of time for her to jog alone, and she was late coming home that day. Another change was that she now slept on the floor of the rear bathroom. She was chained to the toilet. Though this allowed far more freedom of movement than the box, she was still bound, beaten, and raped constantly. She was always bound and stretched out to make it as uncomfortable for her as possible. The Hookers were always careful to conceal the true nature of their relationship with Colleen. There were slip-ups, however. One day, 3-year-old Kathy walked into the bathroom and found Colleen chained to the toilet. She asked Colleen to fix her some breakfast, but Colleen explained that Cameron would have to do it that morning. Cameron was displeased, so from that point onwards, there was a new rule. Colleen was required to lock the door on the inside. She was granted the freedom to contact family members, though the contact was closely monitored by Cameron, and all letters were sent without a returning address. The dynamic between Cameron and Colleen shifted when she told him she loved him. He also professed to love her. He even confided in her about his plans for the future. The discipline wasn't as vicious as it used to be. Meanwhile, Cameron's relationship with Janice was undermined. He had promised not to have intercourse with Colleen, but that was happening regularly by this point. As these tensions mounted, Colleen was granted even more privileges, like celebrating Christmas with the Hookers. She even received a present, a new sleeping bag. More tensions emerged in Colleen's relationship with Janice. It got to the point where they bickered with each other constantly. Determined to put a stop to it and re-establish that he was dominant in the household, Cameron drove them separately to an isolated location nearby and lashed them with whips and ropes until they agreed to get along. The change in their relationship did not last, and Cameron made some drastic decisions. He made Janice quit her job to take care of the children full-time. Colleen was put back in the box. Cameron decided to be lenient enough to allow Colleen to visit her parents, but not before more disciplinary exercises, like suspending her from the rafters of his father's barn. Another exercise, designed to remind her of her place in the household, involved placing the end of the barrel of a shotgun in her mouth. Cameron ordered her to pull the trigger. Fearing the consequences of doing otherwise, she pulled it. She heard a click. Cameron told Colleen that he paid the company $30,000 to arrange for all the surveillance that would keep watch over her during her visit to her family. He told her that the company wanted to test her. For instance, they might show her their quote-unquote museum where skeletons of runaway slaves remained. He said others were sealed in huge jars of formaldehyde. Colleen was confined in the box before the day of her departure, that being March 20th, 1981. She was ordered to keep down until he told her she could sit up. Once they were heading south on Interstate 5, he allowed her to sit up. He gave her a story to tell about him and ensured that it was well rehearsed. She was to tell her parents that he was her boyfriend and that his name was Mike. He was dropping her off in Riverside en route to San Diego, where he was to attend a computer seminar. She would tell them they were engaged and about to change address. That would be the reason she would give for not being able to give them a phone number and address with which to contact her until they were settled. Her family were so happy to see her, they didn't press her to give reasons for her absence. She was only going to be there for a very short time, so they wanted to enjoy it. Jack couldn't help but notice that she came across as pale, tired, and in ill health. At one time, Colleen had had a more curvaceous figure, but during this visit she was emaciated. At some point, her younger sister, Bonnie, asked her why she didn't write to her. Colleen simply told her that she couldn't. Bonnie got a feeling while looking into Colleen's eyes that something was terribly wrong, but she couldn't bring herself to press her for more information. Though she was promised that she would get to spend an entire weekend with her family, Cameron picked her up before 24 hours had elapsed. Mike met her family, leaving with Colleen after 10 minutes. She was dying to tell them the truth about Mike and what he had been subjecting her to, but she was still convinced that the company would kill them as a result, so she kept it to herself. Once Cameron brought Colleen back home, he raped her and put her back in the box. One day, after 48 Cameron-free hours, he brought her out of the basement and into his truck with Janice and their baby, Kathy. She was taken to another house. Once inside, her blindfold and handcuffs were removed. She stood in a bedroom. There was a large waterbed in front of her. It was raised on a high wooden pedestal. Cameron pointed at a hole in the base. It was an entrance to a space underneath the bed. He said, "This is where you're going to be staying." After she crawled underneath, he pushed aside a board and locked it shut. The Hookers had purchased a single-wide trailer and set it up on a rural property. They wanted privacy. Well, Cameron wanted privacy. He didn't want to be interrupted while torturing his slave. There were air holes cut into the sides, but otherwise she was subjected to sensory deprivation as before. She was allowed out 1 hour a day to eat, brush her teeth, use the bathroom, clean out her bedpan, and help with housework. Every 2 weeks, she was permitted to shower and wash her hair. There was no air conditioner or even a fan in the room, and during the summer, she sweltered. Cameron would take her outside to do yard work. She didn't mind, since it took her out of the box. There was one job whose implications came across as ominous. He told her to dig a rectangular hole. He didn't explain what it was for. She worried that she was digging her own grave. Fortunately, it was just used to bury a railroad tie. Cameron built a shed out back. He brought Colleen to the shed and hung her by her wrists. It was a jarring reminder of what he used to put her through, and she thrashed her legs about. This angered Cameron, but he didn't retaliate. A week later, Cameron took Colleen to the shed again. Janice accompanied them. He gagged Colleen and put a cloth over her eyes. He taped it around her head. He put the leather cuffs on her wrists, stood her on a bucket, and hooked the cuffs to the shed's rafters. To restrict her movement, he tied her ankles to a stick. He kicked the bucket out from under her. Colleen swung her legs and made choking sounds. Cameron was apoplectic. He said, "If you'd done it right the first time, you wouldn't have to go through all this." She tried desperately to find a platform to place her feet to relieve the pressure on her arms. She accidentally kicked Janice in the stomach. Janice was pregnant. Cameron was furious. He ran to the house. He returned with whip in hand. He said, "Just hang there and behave." He whipped her mercilessly. As she writhed from the pain, she began to kick her legs again involuntarily. Cameron interpreted this as a show of disobedience. He grabbed her legs and tied them to something. It seemed to Colleen that it might have been an engine of some sort. She groaned from the pain, and this provoked even more of Cameron's wrath. She was not allowed to complain about the pain. After he returned, she heard a match being struck. Through the tiny slit that afforded her a limited view of what went on around her, she saw a flame moving toward her breast. He burned it. She watched in horror as it seared her skin. At first, she cried out, but he kept telling her to shut up. He burned both breasts with the matches. The only way she could get through it was to dissociate, experiencing it as if it were happening to somebody else. She decided that from that day forward, she would not give Cameron Hooker the satisfaction of seeing her cry. Colleen had been granted a free year, so to speak. She had spent most of that year out of the box and had even gone outdoors for long stretches of time. Now Cameron had brought her back to the box. It was summer and she roasted in the box like a rotisserie chicken. On one occasion, the Hookers went away for a weekend and left Colleen to suffer in the box. No food, no water, relentless heat. It got to the point where she began to believe she would die of dehydration. When the Hookers returned, she struggled to stand. It was like they left her to die. Taking this into account, they were considerate enough the next time to leave a quart of water and some chocolate chip cookies behind for her. One day Colleen had had all she could take of the box. She had been acquiescent and submissive up until then, but like most people, she had her limits. Cameron was at work and Janice was in hospital undergoing surgery. With the house empty, she began to kick at the box. She unleashed all her fury and strength. To her astonishment, the particle board broke off. Still, she did not escape. She was still convinced that the company were watching her. To her amazement, when Cameron demanded to know what happened to the box, her confession did not elicit more abusive behavior from him. He simply just put it back together with her inside. Cameron confided in both Janice and Colleen that he wanted to kidnap more women. Not only would they become his slaves, but they would bear children for him. Both Colleen and Janice hoped this would never come to pass. With Colleen's assistance, Cameron built himself a slave dungeon out back. Colleen didn't mind this as much as the box, because there was room to move around. Because it was underground, it was cooler, and she had a comfortable lounge chair to sleep on. He even provided her with a Bible to read and a radio to listen to. Eventually she had to be removed because it flooded during California's rainy season. December 31st, 1983. Cameron and Janice brought Colleen out of the box and brought her to the kitchen. To her surprise, a birthday cake lit with candles was presented to her. The Hookers even sang happy birthday to her. She was informed that it was a reward for being a good slave. Perhaps as another reward for her compliance, Colleen was allowed out of the box more often, sometimes as frequently as 3 times a day. It wasn't always for the purpose of doing chores. Sometimes she would have coffee with Jan. The women struck up a personal friendship to the point where Colleen was permitted to address Janice by her first name. For a change, it was Janice that was subjected to more than the usual amount of torture and degradation in the bedroom. He told her it was done out of concern for her soul. When he stretched her limbs to their limits, He hoped the demons or devils that possessed her would be too uncomfortable to carry on as they were, and would therefore depart from her soul. Some kind of horse shit like that. Colleen was being fed well, and she was putting on weight. With all the time spent out of the house, she was getting her vitamin D, and she looked healthier. She was no longer sleeping under the bed. Now she slumbered atop a sleeping bag in the living room. None of this was done to make Colleen happy. That is not the point of a master-slave relationship. Only the master is supposed to be happy. Cameron was confident that, with Colleen being trusted enough to go outdoors without running away, she could get a job and help support the hookers. Though she had no choice, he sweetened the deal in her mind by saying, "I'm sticking my neck out. I don't have the $1,500 to pay the company's security fee, but I'll let you go out and work. The money you earn will be saved, and when there's enough, I'll buy a little house trailer you can live in." Colleen was hired by the King's Lodge Motel as a maid. Her routine consisted of doing gardening chores for the hookers in the morning and doing her housekeeping duties at the motel for the rest of the day. She so impressed the owner with the high standard of her work that she was promoted to first maid. Some of her co-workers noticed some oddities about her home life, like how she gave all her paychecks to the hookers and rarely had money for so much as a soft drink from a vending machine. Cameron committed a crucial error when he gave Colleen permission to go to church. Eventually, she and Jan went to services regularly. Cameron proposed the idea to Janice of having children with Colleen. He cited a biblical passage in the book of Genesis, which laid out the story of Sarai and Hagar. The passage goes, "Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children, and she had an Egyptian maidservant, whose name was Hagar. So Sarai said to Abram, 'See now, the Lord has restrained me from bearing children. Please go into my maid. Perhaps I shall obtain children by her.' And Abram heeded the voice of Sarai. Then Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar her maid, the Egyptian, and gave her to her husband Abram to be his wife." Cameron said to Janice, "It's like biblical times, and you'll make it easier on yourself if you just accept Kay as my slave wife, because I'm going to sleep with her whether you like it or not." Janice struggled to accept this. She could accept Colleen as Cameron's slave. She even indulged him when he ordered her to have lesbian sex with Colleen. But could she accept Colleen as his concubine? That was something else entirely, and she wasn't keen on the idea. Cameron didn't wait for her to make up her mind. He told Colleen that she needed sex, and God told him that he was appointed to play that role. Eventually he managed to win Janice over, and threesomes became a mainstay of their sex lives. Once when Janice was sick, Colleen brought her flowers. Janice was so moved by this gesture that once she was well, she brought roses for Colleen. A card was attached in which she wrote, "Hagar, I love you." She signed it, Sarai. Still, Janice was not convinced that Cameron's interpretation of the Sarai-Hagar story gave him permission to maintain the arrangement with Colleen. He had used the Bible against her in the past. She also felt he had it within him to kill her if she defied him. He was still obsessed with the idea of capturing more girls and enslaving them. She didn't want her daughters to witness anything inappropriate. She got to a point where she could not live that way anymore. One day in July, she asked Cameron to kill her. Specifically, she asked him to strangle her, as he did many times in the past. He obliged, but though he choked her unto her death, he He did not succeed in escorting her to the grave, and she survived. To be precise, he balked at the last minute. One day, Janice approached Frank Dabney, the pastor at the church she had been attending with Colleen, and asked him questions about the Hagar scenario while disclosing a few details of her own life. He told her they were living in sin. He suggested they make changes. He didn't have to go with a hard sell. Janice believed he was right. She had believed it all along. It was a relief to hear an outsider confirm what she had always been feeling. This would undermine the control Cameron had over his wife and Colleen. August 9th, 1984. Janice Hooker took action. She drove to King's Lodge at 11:30 a.m. and asked to speak with the woman they knew as Kay. When Janice tracked her down, she took a hammer to the clouded window of deception and illusion Cameron pulled down in front of her. She said, "Kay, I need to tell you something. Cameron lied to you about everything. The company, the slavery contract. All that he told you about me being a slave, all that was just lies. He lied to scare you, to make you stay his slave." Inwardly, Colleen was blasted by emotion. She was saddened, hurt, and outraged that Cameron would lie to her and to keep it up for so long. 7 years of her life were stolen from her due to this, and she cried as she mourned. Janice was also in tears. She said, "I hope you can find it in your heart to forgive me." Unsure as how to approach leaving the situation, they sought guidance from Pastor Dabney. They told him they couldn't leave that very moment because they had no time to collect their belongings. Janice also had her children to think about. Dabney suggested they leave the following day after Cameron departed for work. That night was mostly typical in the Hooker household. Cameron didn't suspect that he was about to be deserted. Janice refused to sleep with him and was exiled to the living room to sleep next to Colleen. She didn't mind. The next day after Cameron left for work, the two women packed up their possessions, picked up the girls at school, and drove to Janice's parents' home in the town of Gerber, which was located a short distance away. They took them in. Colleen phoned her father and asked if she could stay with him. He told her she could and sent her money to take a bus to his town. The morning after, when her bus was about to depart, Colleen went to a payphone and placed a call to Cameron. She said to him, "I just wanted to tell you that I'm leaving, that I know you lied about everything, and you can't keep me here anymore." His reaction was the most shocking of all she encountered in 7 years. He cried. Janice's family was convinced that she and Cameron just had a lover's quarrel and that she should return to him, especially for the girls' sake. She did, and he appeared to be committed to reforming his behavior for a while. But eventually he devolved back into vintage Cameron Hooker. One day, she convinced him that one way to get past this hump was to burn his BDSM equipment and related paraphernalia. He threw it all in a burning barrel. S&M magazines, whips, leather cuffs, the gas mask, the slavery contract, slides of Colleen being tortured. It was all incinerated. Colleen had contact with both Janice and Cameron. He knew little about such domestic projects as how to make a tuna sandwich. Janice was the only person alive in whom Colleen could confide about her experiences. The Hookers managed to convince her not to report them to police. Jan was more of a slave to Cameron than Colleen ever was. That was demonstrated when she said to her one day that he was truly willing to change. She said, "We owe him that chance." Colleen was so pliable and selfless, she agreed to do this. Her family objected, insisting that she report his actions to law enforcement. She expressed her feelings in a letter. Aside from details about her everyday life, she told them she would forgive them because she felt it was what God would want. Janice and Cameron split for the last time after he demonstrated an unwillingness to change. He claimed his abusive behavior was due to a hormonal imbalance, and that all he needed to do to treat it was drink 1 beer every night. One day she confided in Pastor Dabney, telling him everything about what Cameron had done to her and Colleen. He called the Tehama County Sheriff's Office. Janice was interviewed by Under Sheriff Mike Blanuza. At one point, she disclosed that Cameron had abducted another girl, Marie Elizabeth Spanhutke, in her presence, and that she was an accomplice. It took place on January 31st, 1976. She told him that Cameron killed the girl. She was placed under arrest. It was a cold case, and the police relied entirely upon Janice's cooperation, so she was granted immunity upon request. The allegations were never substantiated with evidence, and the case has never been solved. Colleen was interviewed by a detective. At the end of the interview, she said, "I'm not doing this for revenge, but only because I don't want it to happen to anyone else." November 18th, 1984. Cameron Hooker was placed under arrest. He was charged with kidnapping, rape, sodomy, and an assortment of related charges. December 7th, 1985. Cameron Hooker's preliminary hearing began. The complete list of his 16 felony charges. 1 count of kidnapping involving a dangerous weapon, a knife. 7 counts of rape. 1 count of forcible oral copulation. 1 count of forced penetration with a foreign object. 1 count of forced sodomy. 3 counts of false imprisonment. 2 counts of abducting to live in an illicit relationship. Janice Hooker proved to be an unreliable witness. She answered most questions in monosyllables. She was often inaccurate in her recall of events. She even admitted to having been dishonest throughout her life. The prosecutors were disappointed in her performance. Colleen Stan was much more credible on the stand. Deputy District Attorney Christine McGuire. Do you recall whether or not one time Janice Hooker came down and had a conversation with you approximately the 2nd day on the rack? Colleen, yes. McGuire, and what was that conversation? Colleen, she asked me if I knew where I was, and I said yes, that I was in Red Bluff. And she said no, I wasn't in Red Bluff. And she asked me if she let me go, what would I do? And I told her I would go to the police and tell them I was kidnapped. And she told me I was stupid, and she shut the box back up and went away. The defense took the questioning of Colleen Stan in a different direction. Defense, did you tell Cameron in 1981 you loved him? Colleen, I don't know if it was in 1981. I did tell him one time I loved him. Defense, when was the first time you told him you loved him? Colleen, I don't know. Defense, how many times did you tell him you loved him? Colleen, I don't know. Defense, more than once a week? Colleen, no. Defense, more than once a month? Colleen, no, I don't think so. Defense, did he tell you he loved you? Colleen, when? Defense, while he lived in Pershing. Colleen, yes. Defense, looking back at that time, what kind of feelings did you feel? Colleen: I don't know. I suppose I just felt that I loved him because I was glad to be out of that box, for one thing, and because he gave me a certain amount of freedom. I suppose that was why. Defense: did you feel as though Cameron had given you back your life again? Colleen: yeah, in a way. Defense: did you feel grateful that he hadn't killed you? Colleen: yes. Defense: did you feel dependent upon him? Colleen: yeah, I did at that time. The judge said the case was extremely serious and, to put it mildly, bizarre. He declared that, if the allegations were substantiated, Cameron, quote, would be a danger to the community, end quote. He maintained the bail at $500,000. In another round of questioning, the defense asked Janice Hooker about the arrangement she made with Cameron regarding the woman who would become his slave. Was it your understanding that this person would endure the sadism? Janice: yes. Defense: and that it would stop with regard to you? Janice: I believe some things he might do to me, but the hanging he'd do to the sex slave. Defense: was the hanging the most painful? Janice: yes. Defense: did it end? Janice: no. Defense: what do you understand a sadist to be? Janice: a person who performs acts of bondage, hanging, whipping, and enjoying the pain that the other person suffers. Defense: and what about a masochist? Janice: sexual enjoyment from pain. Defense: is the defendant a sadist? The prosecutor objected. It was sustained. The defense cast doubt on Colleen's testimony due to the Stockholm syndrome that led to her feeling love for Cameron and even a willingness to please him. She wrote the following message to Cameron in an anniversary greeting card in May 1980. Happy 3rd anniversary. Sometimes I feel that being your slave has made me more of a woman. But then there are other times when I feel it has made me less of a woman. You know how to make me feel good about myself, and I love you so much for it. I only wish that my dreams could be fulfilled with you, because I feel strong love and need to be with you. I'll always serve you with singleness of heart. She wrote a letter at Christmas which even further threatened to stab holes in her assertion that she was kept by Cameron Hooker against her will. This is my Christmas letter to express and give my love to my master. You ask me to tell you how much I love you, but I haven't ever been able to tell you because I don't know the right words to describe how much I love you. But I seem to be falling deeper and deeper into love with you with each passing day. I find love hard for me to express with words, but you bring the passion out in me, and it's a way of expressing my love for you. You've always spiritually inspired me, and I can't tell you how much I love you for it. More than any words I know could ever tell. It's not easy being a slave, but your love makes it worth being your slave. I hope that you're right about how things will change for the better and that I'll have your child someday. I promise you I'll give you a son. I know you'll be proud of him, and I hope you'll love him as much as you love me. I know that I have great faith in God. I read this in St. Luke, for with God nothing shall be impossible. And I think you know how important it is to me to do everything with God in my heart. I need and want his guidance and strength. I can't explain how happy it made me feel inside when you told me that if I ever have your child, that you would take me as your spiritual wife. I pray it will be someday, that God will recognize our love and commitment, and that he'll join us to be one, and that even though I'll be your bondmaid, slave, and second wife, that no one or anything will ever separate us. I wish you a Merry, Merry Christmas, and the best of New Year's. I pray that God will always hear your prayers and always answer them, and that the Holy Ghost will always be with you to guide you and to give you insight and understanding so that you will always do that which will make your soul feel good. I love you more than words could ever say. K. From the interior of another card, which read, "Just because I love you," on the outside. Love is not a single act, but a climate in which we live, a lifetime venture in which we are always learning, discovering, growing. It is not destroyed by single failure, nor won by a single caress. You cannot learn to love by loving one person only, for love is a climate of the heart. My love for you is growing with every changing day. You fill my life with happiness and love. And I pray that that happiness and love will never end. Love, K. When asked why she wrote the anniversary message, she said, "I suppose it was because I wanted to have something to celebrate." She had not been celebrating birthdays and holidays, so she wanted this one milestone to be something to be feted. More evidence that was used against her were her parents' home phone records. Several calls were made to the Hookers, including to Cameron. When asked who she spoke to on every occasion, all Colleen would say is, "Probably Jan." With that, she was excused. To shed light on how Colleen could have brought herself to the point of loving Cameron Hooker and even maintaining ties to him following her escape, a psychologist by the name of Dr. Chris Hatcher took the stand and shared his knowledge of the processes that lead a captive to become subservient and, in some cases, even dependent upon the master. In the courtroom, D.A. McGuire presented a blown-up copy of an article from We magazine entitled "Brainwashing: How to Fold, Spindle, and Mutilate the Human Mind in 5 Easy Steps." It was written by Harvard-educated psychologist Timothy Leary. Hatcher went over the article when he took the stand. He introduced the 5 steps. Step 1. Seize the victim and spirit her away. Step 2. Isolate the victim and make her totally dependent on you for survival. Step 3. Dominate the victim and encourage her to seek your recognition and approval. Step 4. Instruct the victim and re-educate her to think and act in terms of your ideology. Step 5. Seduce the victim and provide her with a new sexual value system. Hatcher described other coercive techniques Cameron used to establish and maintain control over Colleen. Present a goal or a model of future behavior, a model of how to please the captor. Threaten family and relatives with a similar fate. Threaten to sell the captive to an even worse master. Continue to beat and torture the captive at irregular intervals. Irrelevant leniency. This consists of allowing small privileges for no reason, making the captive more confused and more pliant. Obtain further confessions and signed documents, having the captive give over more and more control in writing. Incorporate new behavior goals. In conclusion, Dr. Hatcher said, "It's enormously time-consuming to carry out a successful coercion. It takes a lot of time, a lot of thought, a lot of energy. And people have difficulty doing that over a period of time. They have to attend to other processes of life, and I'm speaking of the captor. So you need to establish some type of pattern where you won't have to be constantly physically monitoring this person." One way Cameron Hooker accomplished this was by allowing Colleen to attend to her personal hygiene, wear real clothing, and have some privacy aside from being bound inside a box. Taking a historical view of slavery, Dr. Hatcher said, there are many historical examples where slaves not only outnumbered their masters in terms of manpower, but also had the opportunity to attempt an escape. And yet, that's done in only a very small percentage of cases. Hatcher also gave his analysis of Hooker's decision to give a copy of the Bible to Colleen. Part of Christianity emphasizes that you are going to suffer, and that God will provide, that no matter what type of disaster or terrible situation may befall you, if you maintain your faith in God, God will get you out of it. Some captors use a religious tract. They want to assist the captive along the pathway of believing they should have faith in God, and that God is really part of all of this, that this is not alien from Christianity. It incorporates the captivity within the framework of what's normal and serves often to make the person more religious. The sad part is that it does make the captive easier to control. Expressing his theories about the psyche of Cameron Hooker, he said, "The main thing here is that the captor is not necessarily an individual of extraordinary intelligence. He doesn't necessarily have to have a comprehensive kind of knowledge, as, for example, Dr. Leary might have in constructing the article we talked about before. What comes across consistently, however, is that the person, to some extent, has a feeling that is like a hunter. Think of the person in your acquaintance who is the best hunter. It usually isn't the chief executive officer of the bank, a person who has a very high degree of status. It's a kind of sense or skill that makes them a particularly good deer hunter or duck hunter, a certain amount of patience. The analogy drawn for me by the individuals I have interviewed is that they see themselves in a similar way as a hunter. Initially, they are concerned with the stalking and the capture. Then, rather than killing the prey, they see how far they can train this person. After a while, curiosity sets in to see just how far he can let this person go and still have control. There is a certain risk or gamble there, but this is outweighed by the value or degree of enjoyment and satisfaction, the sense of being able to hunt with higher stakes, the gratification from being able to allow the person contacts with outside people and still know that you have enough coercion and pressure upon them. That's an extraordinary reinforcement and overcomes some of the other concerns about apprehension. When asked about Colleen's phone calls and letters to the Hookers, Dr. Hatcher said, "There is a great deal of dependency upon the wife in the situation you've described. It's not as if there was a relatively rapid, clean escape without having the possibility the captor might come after her." By talking to Cameron while realizing it wouldn't result in her being put back in the box, Colleen gradually begins to feel they have a greater degree of control, that they have reestablished themselves somewhat. Once a captive like Colleen has been emancipated, it's not unusual for them to convey the, quote, idea that they want to let God or someone else take charge of retribution or punishment. He quoted sections of Colleen's letters to Cameron and Jan, saying, for example, "I don't want to play God, and I forgive you and Cameron for all things." He also pointed out that a reluctance to press charges may be indicative of a fear of reliving the trauma. All Cameron's lawyer did was make a half-assed attempt to cast aspersions on Dr. Hatcher's assertions regarding the master-slave relationship, as well as his professional record and standing. He failed. The next to take the stand was the defendant. His lawyer, Roland Papendick, asked him about the events of May 19, 1977. Papendick: "Did Jan know what you were going to do?" Hooker: "Yes." Papendick: "Do you remember what you were doing prior to that?" Hooker: "We were going to go up into the hills and practice bondage." Cameron confessed that he kidnapped Colleen at knife point, though he insisted that he did not hold it to her throat. He said he held it against her chest and stomach. Papendick: why did you kidnap her? Hooker: I had a fantasy of practicing bondage on a girl who couldn't say no. For the remainder of his testimony, he claimed to feel remorseful almost immediately after the abduction. He claimed there was no sex and very little torture. In a nutshell, he downplayed the torture and portrayed himself as an inexperienced offender with more imagination than brains. He claimed the slavery contract was Janice's idea. In fact, he perjured himself regularly, and the bulk of it involved assigning responsibility for the torture to Janice. He also claimed that the sex with Colleen was not coerced, that she seduced him. The next day he was questioned by Prosecutor McGuire, and she was in no mood for his bullshit, which she could have smelled with a clothespin on her nostrils. McGuire: you were out hunting, weren't you? Hooker: no, I was not. McGuire: you took Jan and the baby with you to lure a woman, didn't you? McGuire: no. McGuire: why did you build the head box? Hooker: so Jan could scream and yell without everyone in the neighborhood hearing her. McGuire: why didn't you use a gag? Hooker: they don't work that well. You ought to try them and see how they work. There was some scattered laughter throughout the courtroom. McGuire: thank you, but I don't think I will. The tone in the room ran to solemnity once again. McGuire: it excites you to see a woman hung, doesn't it? Hooker: yes. McGuire: does it cause you to have an erection? Hooker: yes, it can. McGuire: on Friday, you said that when you used your whips, you didn't hurt Jan or Colleen, just played. Is that right? Hooker: yes. McGuire showed Cameron a photograph of Janice. There were welts on her back. McGuire: those marks on her back, are those from playing, Mr. Hooker? Hooker: yes, they are. McGuire assailed his claims that he was a loving master. McGuire: you had a young naked woman held captive, and you just held her hand? She asked him what inspired him to make the head box. He said he just made it up. She asked him about the rack. McGuire: did you get the idea from a magazine or video, Mr. Hooker? Hooker: no, I did not. She asked him about Colleen's second meal in his house, the 2 egg salad sandwiches he whipped her for not finishing. He said, I didn't care if she ate. She asked him about the bedpan. He said she only used it for a few days and then was allowed to use the bathroom upstairs. McGuire asked him if he shared his master and servant fantasies with Janice. He said he had. She asked him if he practiced bondage with Janice while she was pregnant. He said he did, but that he didn't hang her. Following this, McGuire displayed several photographs of Janice while she was in the 3rd trimester, hanging from what Hooker referred to as the X. He claimed she was standing. He denied their deal that he could have a sex slave if he gave her a child. He referred to the practice of holding Colleen's head underwater until she almost drowned as playing. He admitted that he lied to Colleen about the fictitious company. The verdict. Judge Clarence Knight addressed the foreman of the jury. Judge Knight: Mr. Hogan, I've been informed you've reached a verdict. Hogan: yes, Your Honor. A bailiff carried a stack of verdict forms to the court clerk, Crystal Davis, who stood and read aloud. Davis: Count 1, guilty of kidnapping, special allegation of having used a knife. True. Count 2, guilty of rape. Count 3, guilty of rape. Count 4, guilty... All told, Cameron Hooker was found guilty of 10 felony counts. The jury was hung on the 8th count. Making a conclusive statement about the outcome, Judge Knight said, "I would like to say that I know what a terrible emotional strain it must have been for all of you to go through this. Looking back on it, you can say that in a way it's a happy ending, because faith and love, and I mean Colleen Stan's faith in God and her love of her family, did triumph over evil. You have done justice, and I certainly agree with your verdict." November 22nd, the day of Cameron Michael Hooker's sentencing. Colleen was given an opportunity to make a victim impact statement. She asked her attorney to read a prepared statement on her behalf. She requested that Cameron Hooker be locked away for as long as possible so that he could not victimize other women. Judge Knight commented on the offender. "I consider this defendant the most dangerous psychopath that I have ever dealt with, in that he is the opposite of what he seems. He will be a danger to women as long as he is alive, and I intend to sentence the maximum possible due to this pattern of violent conduct and high degree of cruelty and callousness." Knight sentenced Hooker to consecutive sentences for his sex offenses, which amounted to a term of 60 years. He added indeterminate sentences of 1 to 25 years for the abduction. He piled on another 5 to 10-year sentence for the use of the knife. Were the California Board of Corrections to opt to apply the full terms, he stood to serve a maximum of 104 years. Hooker smiled vaguely when Knight added a fine of $50,000. Once the hearing was over, Hooker turned to Papendick and said, "I want you to thank the judge for me. I have a library, a gym, and time to enjoy them. And it's better than living with those 2 women." Janice Hooker filed for divorce on January 28, 1986. Colleen said to a media scrum, "I am very glad that he won't ever be able to hurt me or anyone else again." She was asked what kept her going during her time inside the box. She said, "It was very hard. At times I'd come to a point where I couldn't take it anymore, and I'd just want to let go." Colleen managed to find happiness and fulfillment during the years since her incarceration in the Hooker house. She said, "I just decided that I'm going to do my best to put it behind me. I'm not going to let them keep me from doing what I want with my life." Colleen has not had contact with Janice Hooker for several years. Colleen received some monetary compensation. The California Victim Witness Program awarded her over $20,000. A civil suit against Cameron Hooker resulted in an out-of-court settlement with the Puritan Insurance Company, the insurers of the Hooker's trailer. They paid her $150,000. One of Colleen's dreams was to have children, and she gave birth to a girl on April 23, 1987. Colleen revealed that she heard from Cameron one last time after his conviction. He called her from jail 3 days after he was found guilty. At first, she didn't recognize his voice. Perhaps being confined in a space from which he was unable to escape changed him in some way. He said to her, "This is Cameron, and I just called so that you can chew my butt out or say whatever you want to me." She said, "I have nothing to say to you." Thank you for listening to Human Monsters. Bye for now.